Tonight, I want to take you somewhere that no map has ever charted and no compass has ever pointed to. Not a place far away, a time. 66 million years ago, give or take a few 100,000 years in either direction, the world was nothing like the one outside your window. The continents sat in different positions. The oceans were warmer and shallower and reached further inland than they do now. The air was thicker and richer and smelled of things that have not existed since. The sky held creatures that had no name yet because there was no one to name them. The ground shook with footsteps heavier than anything alive today. This is the Cretaceous period, the last chapter of the age of the great reptiles, before the sky fell and the world reset itself, and something smaller and warmer inherited what was left. My name is Edmund Marsh. I am a naturalist, or I was before the ship went down and the current took me where it wanted, and I washed up on a shore that I have not been able to identify on any chart I have ever seen. I've been keeping this journal since the second day. There was nothing to write with on the first day. I was too busy surviving. So settle in if you haven't already. Let the room go quiet around you. And let's ease into tonight together, one page at a time. I should say, before anything else, that I am not a superstitious man. I am a man of science. I catalog. I observe. I record. I look for patterns in the natural world, and I write them down in precise language. I have done this for 19 years. I have cataloged 3 new species of beetle in the coastal shallows of Madagascar. I have documented the migratory behavior of a subspecies of petrel that was previously unknown. I am methodical. I am patient. I do not believe in monsters. I have never believed in monsters. I am beginning to revise this position. The journal begins here, day 2. Because day 1 I had nothing to write with and I was, as I mentioned, busy surviving. The ship was called the Perseverance. She was a mid-sized research vessel out of Portsmouth, carrying 6 crew and myself and another naturalist named Albright, who had been my colleague for 11 years, and who I had last seen clinging to the main mast before the wave took everything. The storm came up from nowhere in the Strait of Gibraltar, which is not where storms like that come from. There was no warning. One moment, the sea was moderate and the sky was clear, and Albright was telling me something about a specimen jar he had mislabeled, and the next moment the world turned sideways and stayed there. I was below when the hull gave way. I know this because I was thrown against the ceiling of the forward cabin, which means the ship rolled past 90 degrees, which means the keel was briefly above me. I do not remember the next part clearly. I remember cold water. I remember something solid beneath my hands, and I held on to it, and I held on, and I held on. I came ashore on a beach I do not recognize. The sand was fine and very pale. Not white, but close to it, and it extended in a long, gentle curve in both directions until it disappeared around headlands I could not see clearly. Behind the beach was vegetation. And here is where the first difficulty of recording what I found begins. Because the vegetation was not like any vegetation I have ever seen. The trees were enormous. Not merely large in the way that old oaks or redwoods are large, which is large within a scale you can mentally accommodate. These were large in a way that reset the scale entirely. Their trunks were wider than houses. Their canopies were so high above me that the lower branches were still 30 feet from the ground. Beneath them, other plants, ferns mostly, but ferns of a size that I have no reference for. Some of them reached above my head. Some of them reached above 10 of me. The ground was soft and damp, and covered in a layer of green growth so thick and so various that each step required attention. And the air. The air was the most immediately strange thing of all. Dense, warm, carrying scents that I had no words for because I had never encountered the plants producing them. I sat on the beach for a long time before I moved. I sat there, and I looked at the tree line, and I listened to the sounds coming out of it, which were the sounds of a living world, calls and movements, and the distant breaking of something large through undergrowth. And I told myself very firmly that I was a naturalist, and that my job was to observe and record and not to panic. Then I got up and I walked up the beach away from the tree line, and I sat down again further from it. I did this twice more before I finally stayed put. If you're enjoying this so far, a like really does help this channel reach more people. And if tonight is your first time here, welcome. This is what we do. Come back whenever the night gets too loud. The first night on the beach was the longest night of my life. I had salvaged very little from the wreck. A canvas bag that had floated within reach contained the following: a small folding knife, a length of rope perhaps 8 feet long, a tin cup with a dented lid, a waterlogged edition of Lyell's Principles of Geology, which I would not have thought to grab but which was already in my coat pocket, and a pencil. Half a pencil, to be precise. The other half was missing. What I had was perhaps 3 inches of pencil, worn to a stub, and the margins of the geology book. This is what I wrote in those margins on the second day. I had no food. I had no shelter beyond the tree line, which I was not yet willing to enter. I had the beach and the sky and the wreck of the Perseverance somewhere out there beneath the surface of a sea I did not know. I did not sleep the first night. I sat with my back against a rock that had come down from the headland, and I watched the tree line in the dark, and I listened to the sounds, and I tried to classify them by what I knew. Some of them I could not classify at all. There was a sound, shortly after midnight, I estimated, that began low and built slowly over the course of perhaps 2 minutes to a volume that I felt in my chest before I heard it with my ears. A deep, resonant sound, rhythmic, almost musical in the way very large things can be musical, the way the lowest notes of an organ are musical, felt rather than heard. It came from inland. It lasted on and off for about 20 minutes. Then it stopped. In the silence after it stopped, the jungle made no other sound for perhaps 5 full minutes. Whatever had been calling, everything else had heard it and held its breath. I held mine. Then, slowly, the other sounds came back. The chirping of things I could not see. The movement in the canopy above the tree line. The distant crack of something large in the undergrowth, further away than before, moving away from the direction of the call. I sat with my back against the rock and I watched the darkness, and I was very glad that whatever had made that sound was doing so from some distance away. By dawn I was cold enough to move and hungry enough to do something about it. The beach gave up little. Some small crustaceans in the tide pools at the base of the headland. Nothing I recognized, but nothing that appeared actively poisonous, and I ate them raw because I had no way to make fire, and hunger is a very efficient remover of hesitation. They tasted of salt and something faintly sweet underneath it, and they were not enough, but they were something. I filled the tin cup from a small freshwater stream that came down through the sand from somewhere in the vegetation above the beach. The water was clear and cold and tasted of stone and green things, and I drank 3 cups of it and felt marginally better. Then I sat on a rock and I looked at the tree line and I had a conversation with myself that went roughly as follows. You are a naturalist. You have spent 19 years studying the natural world. The natural world is outside this beach and inside that tree line. You need food and shelter. Both of those things are in there. You also do not know what else is in there. But sitting on this beach will not feed you and will not shelter you, and the tide is coming in and will eventually cover the beach entirely. And the rock you are sitting on will be underwater by tonight. I went into the tree line. The first thing I noticed, stepping off the sand and onto the forest floor, was the change in sound. The beach sound disappeared almost immediately, swallowed by the density of the vegetation, and in its place was the interior sound of the jungle, which was layered in a way that no temperate forest I had ever been in was layered. Near sounds. The drip of moisture from leaf to leaf. The creak of an enormous branch shifting in a wind that barely reached the ground level. The buzz and click of insects that were not quite like any insects I had ever heard. Far sounds. Those distant calls, now closer than they had been from the beach. And something that was almost music and almost not, a series of low tones from somewhere deep in the green. I moved carefully. I kept the sound of the sea behind me so I could find my way back to the beach if I needed to. I watched where I put my feet. The ground was extraordinarily alive, covered in growth so dense that every step required attention. The trees were even larger up close than they had appeared from the beach. Standing at the base of one, looking up, the trunk disappeared into the canopy above and the canopy above disappeared into itself, and I could not see the sky from directly beneath. The bark was rough and very dark and damp to the touch, coated in moss and other smaller plants that grew on the tree itself. A whole small world existing on the surface of a larger world. I found water almost immediately. A stream, wider than the one on the beach, running clear over stones that were coated in algae so thick and so green it looked painted on. I drank. I refilled the tin cup. I continued. The ferns were the dominant undergrowth. Some of them came up to my chest. Some were taller than I am, and I am not a short man. They moved in the air currents that moved through the forest at ground level, and the movement of them, the constant, slow shifting, gave the forest a quality of being perpetually in motion, as though the whole thing were breathing slowly. I had been walking perhaps 30 minutes when I heard the first thing that stopped me. It was a sound from the canopy, not the distant sound of something large, something closer, directly above me, or close to it, a sound that I cannot describe accurately in words and will try anyway. Imagine the sound that a large bird makes when it lands on a branch, the impact of weight on wood. And then beneath that sound, something that was almost a voice, almost a call, rhythmic, and patterned in a way that suggested something more than random noise. I looked up. In the canopy, 50 feet above me, something very large was moving. I could not see it clearly. The light through the canopy was green and filtered and broken into patterns by the movement of leaves, and whatever was up there was moving through the leaves rather than below them, using the canopy itself as its floor. I could see the displacement of branches. I could see the occasional flash of something pale and large. I could hear the sound of something gripping wood and releasing it, moving from branch to branch with a weight and deliberateness that was entirely unlike a bird. It stopped. I stood very still. For perhaps 30 seconds, nothing happened. The ferns moved. A drop of water fell from somewhere above and hit a leaf near my foot. Then the thing in the canopy shifted and moved on, westward along the tree line, and the sounds of its movement faded slowly, and I was left standing in the green light with my heart doing things it does not normally do. I wrote in the margin of the Lyell something in canopy. Large, not a bird, not classifiable, moving with purpose. Then I kept walking, because there was nothing else to do. Drop a comment tonight if you're still with me. Let me know where you're listening from. It helps more than you know to feel the room full of people on the other side of this. I should describe the light more carefully, because it is important to understanding everything else that followed. Inside the forest, the light was not like sunlight. It was like the idea of sunlight, passed through so many layers of leaf and branch and moss, and the water vapor that hung in the air that by the time it reached the ground, it was something else entirely. Green. Not dark green, not the green of shadow, but a particular saturated living green that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. In that light, everything looked slightly different from how it would look in ordinary sunlight. The ferns looked lit from within. The water in the stream looked almost luminous. My own hands, held out in front of me, looked strange, as though they belonged to someone who had spent a long time underwater. The heat was also important. It was not the dry heat of a desert or the humid heat of a greenhouse. It was the heat of an enclosed living system, the heat produced by 10,000 plants and the creatures that lived among them, all of it trapped beneath a canopy that let very little in or out. By mid-morning, my coat was soaked through, and I removed it and tied it around my waist and continued in my shirt sleeves, which helped somewhat. I found fruit by accident. Something fell from the canopy and hit my shoulder and dropped to the ground at my feet, and I picked it up. It was roughly spherical, the size of a large apple, green on the outside and slightly waxy in texture. I had never seen anything like it. I cut it open with the folding knife, and the inside was pale yellow and wet, and smelled of something I had no reference for. Faintly sweet, faintly acidic, somewhere between a mango and something else entirely. I sat down on a root and thought about this for a moment. I was hungry enough that the risk of eating something unknown was beginning to seem acceptable. I was also aware that eating the wrong thing in an environment I did not understand could end my brief residency here considerably faster than anything else I was likely to encounter. I looked at the fruit. I smelled it again. I touched it to the tip of my tongue. Nothing immediately unpleasant. I waited 5 minutes. Still nothing. I ate half of it and waited another 10 minutes, and then ate the other half and drank from the stream and felt, if not well exactly, then at least less hollow than before. I found 2 more of the same fruit on the ground nearby, fallen from above, and I put them in the canvas bag for later. Then I heard the sound that changed the day completely. It was ahead of me and below me, which was strange because I had been walking on level ground. I moved carefully toward the sound, through a stand of ferns that came up to my chin, and then the ground fell away, and I found myself standing at the edge of a low cliff, perhaps 20 feet high, looking down into a valley I had not known was there. The valley was wide and flat and crossed by the same stream I had been following, which widened considerably at the valley floor. The valley was open enough that the canopy thinned, and actual sunlight fell through in columns, and in those columns of light the air itself seemed golden. And in the valley, on the banks of the stream, and in the shallows and on the flat ground between, there were animals. I stood at the edge of the cliff, and I looked down at them, and for a very long time, I could not move. They were enormous. The largest ones were perhaps 40 feet long, with long necks that curved upward and then angled down to drink from the stream. Their bodies were vast, barrel-shaped, supported on 4 legs like columns of stone. Their skin was a kind of muted gray-green in the direct sunlight, dappled in the way that a large animal's skin dapples when the light comes through leaves. And along their backs ran a line of low bony structures that I could not name because I had no name for anything I was seeing. There were 7 of them that I could count from my position, 3 large and 4 smaller ones, younger, still enormous by any standard I had known before, but dwarfed beside the adults. The young ones moved closer to the adults than the adults moved to each other, staying in the shadow of those vast bodies the way a small boat stays close to the lee of a larger vessel. They drank. They moved slowly along the bank. One of the large ones pulled a branch down from a tree at the far edge of the valley, pulling with its neck and jaw in a slow, deliberate motion, and ate the leaves with a methodical patience that seemed almost meditative. I sat down very carefully on the edge of the cliff so as not to disturb them, and I watched. I watched for perhaps 2 hours. I watched them move and drink and eat and rest. I watched one of the young ones do something that looked almost impossibly like play, moving in a quick circle around the legs of an adult before stopping and standing very still as though embarrassed by its own exuberance. I watched the light change through the valley as the afternoon came in, and the columns of gold shifted, and the shadow of the far tree line crept toward the stream. I wrote in every margin I could find in the lyell. I wrote until the pencil was too short to hold properly, and I had to use the knife to pare it down further. And then I wrote more. I was a naturalist. I had just observed something that no naturalist in the history of the discipline had observed. I had looked down into a Cretaceous valley and watched creatures that my science had known only from bone and stone for decades. I was also alone, with half a pencil and a tin cup and a knife, in a world that operated on a scale I was wholly unsuited to. These 2 facts existed simultaneously, and I was not sure which of them should be the more dominant concern. I chose, in that moment, to let the naturalist win. The other concern would still be there when the light went. Subscribe if you haven't yet. New stories go up every week. And if you've got an idea for a world you'd like to visit next time, leave it in the comments. We read every one. I made it back to the beach before full dark, which was the last straightforwardly good decision I made for some time. The beach was where I had left it. The tide had come in and covered the lower half of it, and the rock I had been sitting on was underwater, which confirmed what I had expected. And I moved up the beach to higher ground and found a place against the cliff face where the rock curved inward enough to provide something approaching shelter. I ate the 2 remaining fruits and drank from the stream where it met the beach, and I lay down with the canvas bag under my head and the lyre pressed against my chest, and I looked up at the sky. The sky in this time is unlike the sky I know. I noticed it first on the beach, and I noticed it again now. The stars are the same. Of course they are. Stars are very far away, and 66 million years is nothing to a star. The same constellations I have always known are overhead in the same positions. But the quality of the air between me and the stars is different. There is more of it, somehow, denser, richer, and the moonlight coming through it has a particular quality I cannot describe except to say it seems closer and brighter than I am used to, as though the atmosphere is doing less to diminish it. I lay there and looked at the stars and thought about Albright. We had worked together for 11 years. He was a meticulous man. He kept 3 copies of every note he made, in case 2 were lost, which I had always found mildly excessive, and now, alone on a beach with half a pencil in the margins of someone else's book, I found I was revising my opinion of considerably. He had an enormous beard that he trimmed with scissors every Sunday, regardless of where in the world he was or what else was happening. He could identify any beetle in Europe on sight, and most of the beetles in Southeast Asia, and he was working on a monograph on the flight patterns of the hawk moth that he had been working on for 7 years, and had 3 chapters left to write. I did not know if he was alive. I did not know if anyone was alive. I did not know if the Perseverance was recoverable, or if anyone would come looking, or if looking was even a concept that applied to wherever this was. I fell asleep thinking about this and dreamed about none of it, which was a mercy. I woke in the night to a sound. Not the low, resonant call from the first night. Something different, closer. A sound I can only describe as deliberate, and by deliberate I mean it had rhythm and direction and seemed to be getting louder in a consistent way that suggested approach. I sat up. The beach was bright in the moonlight, the pale sand almost luminous, and the tree line at the back of the beach was dark and still, and the sound was coming from the tree line. Not from inside it, from the tree line itself, as though something was moving along it rather than through it, following the edge of the forest. I pressed back against the cliff face, and I watched. At first I could not see anything. The tree line was dark, and the sound was rhythmic and getting louder, and I could feel it now in the ground beneath me, a very low vibration. And then something moved out of the shadow at the far end of the beach and into the moonlight. It was moving on 2 legs. It was perhaps twice my height. Its body was carried forward, counterbalanced by a long, heavy tail that swept low to the sand as it moved. Its front limbs were held close to its body, smaller than I expected given the scale of the rest of it. Its head was large and long, and carried slightly forward on the neck, and it moved with a kind of fluid, unhurried quality that the large 4-legged animals in the valley had not had, that particular lightness of something built for speed. It was moving along the beach away from me. It had not seen me. I did not breathe. It covered the length of the beach in a time that I found difficult to process, that fluid 2-legged gait, eating the distance without apparent effort, and then it reached the far end of the beach where the headland came down to the water, and it paused there at the edge of the cliff, and it lifted its head. The sound it made was not the deep resonant call from the night before. This was higher, sharper, 3 distinct notes in rapid sequence. and from somewhere inland the same 3 notes came back, different enough to be a different individual, but close enough to be unmistakably the same kind of call. It turned and went back into the tree line at the far end of the beach and was gone. I sat pressed against the cliff face for a very long time. Then I wrote in the lyre, bipedal, 2 legs, tail for balance, fast, height approximately 12 feet. Not the same as the valley animals. Predator, reason, the way it moved, the way everything else stopped. I wrote, do not be on the beach at night. Then I lay back down and stared at the sky, and did not sleep again until almost dawn. The 3rd day began with a discovery that should have been good news and turned out to be more complicated than that. I found the wreck. Not the wreck itself, it was still underwater, but the things the wreck had sent to the surface: timber, canvas, rope, 2 supply crates, one intact and one with the lid sprung but the contents still partially present. I found them early in the morning at the low tide line on the beach, and I stood there looking at them for a long moment before I moved. The intact crate contained the following: 12 tins of preserved meat, 4 tins of hardtack biscuit, a coil of wire, 3 glass specimen jars with their corks still in place, a compass, a pocket watch, and wrapped in waxed cloth, a small journal with a pencil attached by a cord. I sat down in the sand and held the journal for a while. It was Albright's. I knew it immediately. The cover had his initials pressed into it. AHA, for Arthur Henry Albright. He had one of these journals on every voyage, always the same size, always with the pencil attached. I had seen them on his desk in Portsmouth, and in his cabin on the Perseverance, and on the table of every field station we had worked at together. I opened it. His handwriting was on the first page, the entry from 2 days before the storm, describing in his careful methodical prose the conditions in the strait, and a note about a specimen he had collected that morning. The rest of the pages were blank. I sat on the beach with Albright's journal in my hands, and the sea moving quietly in and out, and the tree line behind me making its perpetual layered sound. And I thought about a man with an enormous beard who trimmed it every Sunday regardless of circumstances, and who had 3 chapters left to write on hawk moths. Then I closed the journal and attached the pencil cord to my coat button and put it in my inside pocket. Then I went through the rest of the crate very methodically and made a complete inventory in my mind. And then I opened the sprung crate and salvaged what I could from that. By the time I had finished, I had enough preserved food for perhaps 3 weeks if I was careful: a compass, a working watch, sufficient rope and wire to make shelter, and a journal to write in. These were the things I had. What I did not have: any means of signaling for rescue, any means of making fire beyond what I might manage by friction, which I had not yet attempted, any means of defending myself against the thing I had seen on the beach in the moonlight. I also did not have Albright, which was the loss that sat underneath all the others in a way that I was not yet ready to examine directly. If you're following along tonight, thank you. Genuinely. These stories take time to put together, and knowing you're there listening is what makes it matter. Subscribe if this is the kind of thing you come back to. We'll be here. I spent the morning building shelter. The cliff face at the back of the beach had a section where the rock had eroded in a way that left a natural overhang. Not a cave exactly, but a deep recess where the rock curved above and provided a ceiling. It was perhaps 8 feet wide and 4 feet deep, and the floor of it was dry, and the overhang above it was solid. I spent 3 hours making it as inhabitable as I could with what I had. I stretched canvas from the supply crate across the open face, anchoring it at the top with the wire driven into cracks in the rock and weighting the bottom with stones. I moved everything I had salvaged into the interior. I made a bed of sorts from the remaining canvas, folded thick enough that the rock was not immediately felt through it. It was not comfortable. It was survivable. There is a difference, and I was becoming very familiar with the practical meaning of that difference. By noon, I had a shelter and a food supply and a working compass, and I sat in the entrance to my overhang, and I looked out at the beach, and I thought about what to do next. The problem was simple and enormous simultaneously. I did not know where I was. I did not know when I was, or rather, I had a hypothesis that was so profoundly improbable that I had been working around it rather than through it since I arrived. I was a naturalist who had spent 19 years studying the natural world, and I had seen, in 2 days, things that the natural world, as I understood it, had not contained for 66 million years. The implications of this were too large to think about directly, and so I was not thinking about them directly. I was thinking about shelter, and food, and water, and the thing on the beach, and the practical immediate next steps of survival. This is what the mind does when the larger reality is too much. It narrows. It finds the next thing and attends to that. The next thing was, I needed to understand the patterns of this place well enough to move through it without dying. This is what naturalists do. We observe. We find patterns. We use patterns to make predictions. I was going to apply this to the problem of staying alive in the Cretaceous period, because it was either that or sit in my overhang and wait for the preserved meat to run out, and that seemed like a worse option. I opened Albright's journal and I began to write. I wrote everything I had observed so far: the beach, the tree line, the valley and its animals, the bipedal creature on the beach at night, the sounds and their patterns. I wrote it all in the careful, methodical prose that 19 years of fieldwork had made second nature, the prose of a man who knows that what he writes now is what he will have to rely on later. I wrote for 2 hours. Then I went back into the forest. The fourth day brought rain. Not the light drizzle of an English autumn, the rain of a world with a different atmosphere entirely, warm and dense and falling so hard that the canopy above could not contain it, and it came through in sheets, and the floor of the forest, which was already soft and damp, became in 20 minutes a flowing system of small rivers, each fern a channel, each depression a pool. I had retreated to the overhang before the rain reached full force, and I sat in the entrance and watched the beach transform. The sea changed color. The sky came down. The sound of the rain on the canopy was unlike any sound I had heard. A layered roar that was somehow more musical than chaotic, the canopy acting as an enormous instrument, producing one single sustained note that varied in pitch as the rain varied in intensity. It rained for 6 hours. During that time, I wrote, and I watched, and I listened. During that time, I also saw something that I recorded in the journal and have looked back at many times since, still not entirely sure what to make of it. At the far end of the beach, near the headland where the bipedal creature had stood 2 nights before, something emerged from the tree line and sat in the rain. It was not the same kind of animal as the creature from the night. It was smaller, perhaps the size of a large dog, and it moved low to the ground on 4 legs, and it sat at the edge of the tree line and it looked at the sea. I watched it sit there for almost an hour in the pouring rain. It did not look like something threatening. It looked like something thinking. I know that is an absurd description. I am a scientist, and I know that what I was projecting onto it was human. Animals do not think in the way I mean when I use the word thinking. And yet, it sat in the rain, and it looked at the sea. Eventually, it got up and went back into the tree line, and I never saw it again. I wrote it in the journal. I did not know what to make of it. I still do not. Let me know in the comments if you want to hear more of this. There is more. There is considerably more. And your ideas for where else we might go are always welcome down there. The 5th day was the day I made fire. It took the entire morning. I used dry material from inside the overhang, shredded canvas and fine wood from the interior of the supply crate, and a flat piece of driftwood, and a spindle of green wood cut from a branch at the tree line edge. I had made fire by friction before, in field conditions in 3 continents, and I knew the technique, but knowing the technique and having the right materials are 2 different things, and this morning the difference between them took approximately 4 hours to resolve. When the flame finally caught in the tinder bundle, and I blew it carefully into something real, I held it in my cupped hands and felt a relief so large it was almost physical. Fire meant several things. It meant cooked food, which meant less risk from whatever bacteria this world's raw materials might carry. It meant light at night, which meant less darkness and less of the particular anxiety that came with darkness in this place. It meant warmth, because despite the daytime heat, the nights on the beach were cooler than I expected, the temperature dropping enough that I had spent the previous nights in my coat. And it meant, in some way that was more psychological than practical, a line between me and the world outside. Something I had made, something that was mine. I kept the fire small, and I kept it inside the overhang, and I cooked 2 of the tins of preserved meat and ate them both, and drank clean water, and wrote in the journal until the light failed. And then I banked the fire and slept. The 6th day I went deeper into the forest. I had been staying close to the beach, keeping the sound of the sea within earshot, using it as my anchor the way a man in an unfamiliar city keeps a landmark in sight. But I needed to understand more of the territory. I needed to know where the water sources were, where the large animals moved, where the danger concentrated, and where it was absent. I left early, before the heat built, with the compass and the journal and all the food I could carry in the canvas bag. I planned to go 4 hours in and 4 hours back, keeping a bearing of due north and returning on due south. The forest was different at this hour. The morning light through the canopy had a quality the afternoon light did not. Something to do with the angle of it, the way it struck the upper surfaces of the leaves and reflected downward into the green space below. At this hour the insects were louder than later, a wall of sound at certain frequencies that pressed against the ears from every direction. I moved carefully, and I watched everything. The things I saw in those first 4 hours of the 6th day. 3 of the large 4-legged animals from the valley, moving in single file through a gap in the trees too narrow for them to walk side by side, following what I now recognized as a path, not a human path, but a path worn by repeated passage of large bodies through the same route over a long time. They passed perhaps 40 feet from where I stood without appearing to notice me. The nearest one was so large that its flank filled my field of vision completely, a gray-green wall of skin moving past, and the smell of it was something I cannot adequately describe, warm and rich, and strange and absolutely, completely alive. A creature in the canopy that I watched for 20 minutes. Small, perhaps the size of a raven, moving through the upper branches with the agility of something that had been doing this since before I had a name for it. It had feathers. This was the detail that stopped me. Feathers, clearly visible even from below, running along its arms and tail in a pattern that was not exactly like any bird I had ever studied, but was unmistakably related to the idea of feathers. It called twice, a sharp double note, and something from further along the canopy called back. A place where the ground dropped into a shallow depression and the depression held water. Not a stream, but a pool, perhaps 30 feet across, and the pool was surrounded by the prints of animals of various sizes. I studied these for a long time. Some of them I could not interpret at all. Some were large enough that my entire forearm fit inside a single print. And then, on the return journey, moving south back toward the beach, the thing I had not been expecting. A sound from the left, close, and then movement in the undergrowth, and then from between two enormous ferns, something stepped out onto the path in front of me and stopped. It was about 4 feet high at the shoulder. Long body, carried horizontally, balanced by a tail. 2 back legs, shorter front limbs, a long head with eyes that were set forward. Not to the sides the way a prey animal's eyes are set, but forward, which means what it means in any species in any time. Eyes set forward, see depth. Eyes set forward, judge distance. Eyes set forward belong to something that pursues. It looked at me. I looked at it. I was holding very still with the sort of completeness that the body achieves when the mind has stepped back and left pure instinct in charge. I was not deciding to hold still. I was simply still, the way a stone is still. It tilted its head, slightly, the way a dog tilts its head at something unfamiliar. Then it made a sound, low, almost conversational, if conversation is a word I am allowed to use here. It was not the sharp call I had heard in the canopy or the low resonant sound of the large animals. It was something between those two things. It lasted perhaps 3 seconds, and then it stopped. I did not move. It looked at me for another long moment. Then it stepped back off the path and disappeared into the ferns. I stood in the path and my hands were shaking. I had not noticed them shaking until the animal was gone. I wrote in the journal, small predator, 4 feet at shoulder, forward-facing eyes, bipedal in motion but not exclusively. Sound, 3 seconds, low register, appeared non-aggressive, withdrew voluntarily. Then I added, do not know why it left, do not know if it will be back. Then I walked the rest of the way to the beach and sat in the entrance of my overhang for a long time and let my hands finish shaking. If this is settling you in for the night, I'm glad. That's what it's here for. Subscribe if you want to come back. Drop a comment if you have a world you'd like to visit. We'll go. The 7th day he did not leave the beach. This was not a decision made from fear, or not only from fear. It was a decision made from the recognition that I had been moving and discovering and processing at a pace that was not sustainable, and that one day of staying still and writing and thinking and consolidating what I had learned was likely to be more useful in the long run than another day of discovery that I had not had the time to absorb. I wrote for most of the day. I made detailed notes on each creature I had observed, describing as precisely as I could the physical characteristics, the behavior, the sounds, the way it moved, and what that movement suggested about its relationship to everything else. I drew outlines in the margins where words were insufficient. I wrote observations about the forest itself, the structure of it, the way it worked as a system. I also, for the first time, allowed myself to write honestly about the situation rather than around it. I wrote, "I do not know how I came to be here. The storm was real, and the ship going down was real, and the survival was real. What followed is real. I am not confused. I am not suffering any variety of delusion that I can identify. The evidence of my senses is clear and consistent. I am in a period of geological history that, by any scientific understanding I possess, should be inaccessible to a living human being. And yet, here I am. I can smell the forest, and feel the heat, and hear the animals, and eat the fruit from the trees. And everything I experience tells me this is real. I wrote, I do not know how to go home. I do not know if home is somewhere I can go from here. I am not ready to conclude that it is not. But I am also, as of this moment, alone and surviving and in possession of considerable data about a world that no human has ever seen. And if I am going to be here regardless, then I'm going to be a naturalist about it. I wrote, Albright would have had 3 copies of every note before I finished the first one. That was all I wrote about Albright. On the 8th day, the large creature came to the beach. I was at the waterline in the morning checking the tide pools when I heard a sound from the southern end of the beach that was unlike anything I had yet heard. A deep, rhythmic percussion that I felt through the soles of my feet before it resolved into sound at all. I turned. It came around the headland at the southern end of the beach with a deliberateness that suggested it had been there before and knew what it would find. It was the largest animal I had seen yet, larger than the long-necked animals in the valley. Its body was so large and its proportions so extreme that the eye struggled to process it all at once, kept breaking it into sections because the whole was too much. It walked on 2 legs. The back legs were the size of young trees. The tail swept behind it, partly raised, enormous, acting as counterweight to the massive forward and inclined body. The head was long, and carried at the end of a neck that was thick and muscular, and not the graceful arch of the valley animals, but something more purposeful, something built for direction rather than reach. It was armored along the spine with a low ridge of darker material that caught the morning light differently from the surrounding skin. It came down the beach toward the water. I was in the water up to my ankles. I did not move. I did not have time to move in any useful direction before it was close enough that movement would have drawn attention. I stood in the tide pool with the water around my feet, and I was very, very still. It went to the water 50 feet from where I stood, and it drank. The head came down to the surface with a slowness that was almost ceremonial. The water displaced around it. It drank for a long time, the body settling into a slightly different posture as it did. a kind of relaxation that I recognized from watching any large animal drink. The vigilance drops when the head goes down. The body rests. The animal trusts its own size to manage whatever the world presents while it is occupied. I watched it drink. My heart was very loud. After a long time, it raised its head. It looked south along the beach toward the headland. Then it looked north. A slow sweep that took in the tree line and the cliff face and the beach itself. Its eye, when it crossed the space I was standing in, did not stop. I was below its sight line. The tide pool I was standing in was at the base of a rock formation, and I was partly behind one of the larger rocks. I was also, I think, simply not the right size or shape to register as significant. I was very small and very still, and the world was full of small, still things. It finished looking, and it turned and went back the way it had come, around the southern headland, and the sound of it diminished slowly into the distance. I stood in the tide pool for several minutes after it was gone. Then I went back to the overhang and sat down and wrote everything down immediately, while every detail was present, because this is what you do, and because doing it gave my hands something to be busy with. I wrote, "The apex. I have seen the apex." I wrote, "It did not see me. I do not know why. I was very close. I can only conclude that I was lucky, which is not the kind of conclusion I find satisfying, but is the only one that fits the facts." I wrote, "I need a better shelter." Let me know in the comments if you want to hear more of this. And if you're new here, this is what we do. Leave a story idea if you have one. We'll go there next. The 9th and 10th days I spent building. The overhang was adequate, but I could see from the tide marks on the rock that in the highest tides, the water reached the base of the cliff and would eventually reach the overhang itself. I needed to be higher. I also needed to be less visible from the beach, because the beach was a path and large things used it. I moved up. Above the overhang, the cliff face became more irregular, with shelves and protrusions of rock that offered handholds and footholds, and I spent the better part of a day moving my supplies and equipment up to a ledge about 30 feet above the beach, wide enough to lie on and deep enough to sit in and sheltered on 3 sides by the rock. From here, I could see the beach in both directions. I could see the sea. I could see the tree line. I could not be seen easily from below because the ledge was recessed and the rock above it created shadow even in direct sunlight. It was, given the constraints, a good position. I made it as habitable as I could. Canvas for a bed. The supply crates wedged into the back of the ledge. The fire, which I now made reliably and maintained carefully, built on a flat stone in the corner of the ledge where the smoke was dispersed by the breeze before it could form a signal column. On the 10th day, settled on my ledge with the journal and a tin of preserved meat, I looked out at the world that was going to be my world for whatever time I had left, and I tried to think clearly about what I knew and what I did not know and what I needed to find out. What I knew. The beach was a route for large animals. The forest was navigable during daylight if I moved carefully. There were food sources I could access. The water in the streams was drinkable. The night brought different animals than the day, and those animals were of a kind I had not yet been able to study closely enough to understand their patterns. What I did not know, whether anyone was searching for me, whether there was any mechanism by which I might return to my own time. whether the preserved food from the crates would last long enough for either of those questions to answer themselves. What I needed to find out, how far the forest extended, and what it contained. Whether there were places in it that were safer than others. Whether the patterns of the large predators had gaps I could use. I was applying scientific method to survival. I am not sure whether this was admirable or simply what happens when a person with a very specific kind of training encounters a problem with no other tools available. Probably both. On the 11th day, something happened that I had not prepared for in any way. I was on the ledge in the early afternoon when I heard a sound from below. Not an animal sound, a human sound. A voice. I sat up. The voice came again, from the tree line. My name, called in a voice I knew as well as my own. Albright. I was down the cliff face before I had finished thinking about the decision to descend. 30 feet of rock face that I had been careful about for 10 days. I went down in what could not have been more than 2 minutes, moving on instinct and momentum rather than care. I crossed the beach at a run. At the tree line, stepping out from between 2 enormous ferns, was Arthur Albright. He looked terrible. His coat was torn and his beard, which he had presumably not been able to trim on any particular Sunday, had grown considerably. And he was thinner than I had ever seen him, and he was limping on his left leg. He also looked more alive than anyone I had ever seen in my life. We stood on the beach, and I did not know what to say, and neither did he. And then he said, "You have a ledge. I can see the smoke." I said, "How long?" 11 days, he said. I landed north of here. I have been following the beach south. He sat down on the sand because his leg was not cooperating, and I sat beside him, and he said, "There are things in the forest, Marsh." "I know," I said. "Enormous things," he said. "I know," I said. "I have been writing about them." He looked at me, and then he looked at the journal, and he said, "Of course you have." We sat there on the beach in the afternoon sun, and we did not say anything else for a while, and the sea moved in and out the way it always does, entirely indifferent to what had just happened. He had survived. He had walked 11 days south along a coast that contained things that should not exist, and he had survived them, and he was here, on this beach, sitting on the sand, alive. I had the most extraordinary, irrational feeling of hope. That evening, I cooked the last of the fresh fruit I had found with 2 tins of preserved meat, and we ate together on the ledge, and Albright told me what he had seen. He had landed on a beach similar to mine, further north, with very little. A knife, his journal and pencil, and a length of rope. He had spent 3 days on the beach and then gone into the forest. He had found water and some kind of tuber he thought edible, and had been proved right. He had seen the large 4-legged animals. He had seen something he described carefully, precisely, as a group of medium-sized animals moving in coordination, which is a description that made the back of my neck feel strange. "Moving in coordination," I said. "5 of them," he said, "moving together, not randomly, in a pattern. They crossed a clearing I was watching from the edge of, and they moved across it like a net, spread out, sweeping the ground ahead of them. Hunting," I said. He looked at me. "Yes," he said. He said, "I stayed in the tree I was in for 4 hours after they passed." I wrote this in the journal. I wrote it very carefully and in more detail than I usually use because the detail felt important. Animals hunting in coordinated groups. Animals intelligent enough to maintain formation across variable terrain. Animals that, if they found us, would find us together, and together we were still only two people with two knives and some rope. But Albright was alive, and we were together, and I had the extraordinary, irrational feeling of hope, and I kept it. On the 12th day, Albright's leg was worse. He had not told me the night before how bad it was. This was characteristic. He was not a man who volunteered difficulty. He catalogued it. He addressed it methodically. He did not mention it unless directly asked. I found out about the leg when I heard him moving on the ledge in the early morning, and the sound of it was wrong. I looked at the leg in the morning light. It was swollen below the knee. He had wrapped it in torn cloth, but the cloth was not tight enough and the swelling had continued, and in the morning light the leg below the wrapping was a color that was not right. "How?" I asked. "Fall," he said. "Third day. I thought it would manage." I rewrapped it tighter and elevated it on one of the supply crates, and I gave him the remaining water, and I sat on the ledge and thought about what I knew about injuries in the field, which was less than I needed and more than nothing. He needed rest. He needed the leg elevated. He needed the wound, whatever was underneath the cloth, to be cleaned. I had no medical supplies of any kind. I had clean water and the folding knife, which I had been keeping as sharp as the stone allowed. Clean the wound with the water. I rewrapped the leg with the cleanest material I had available. I told him to stay on the ledge and rest. He told me he was perfectly capable of moving, and I told him he was an idiot, and he said he had been told this before, and I said by whom, and he said his wife mostly, and this was the first time he had mentioned his wife, and I did not know he had one, and he looked slightly embarrassed about having mentioned it. He rested. I went into the forest for food. The 13th day, Albright could not stand on the leg at all. The swelling had continued despite everything I had done, and the skin around the wound was hot to the touch, which meant what it means anywhere in any century: infection, the body fighting something it was losing ground against. I stayed on the ledge with him that day and the next. I fed him and gave him water, and I kept the leg clean and elevated, and I watched him carefully for the signs that would tell me which way this was going. He slept more than he was awake. When he was awake, he was alert enough, and he asked me to read to him from the journal, which I did. And he made observations about what I had recorded that were, even now, genuinely useful. He noticed things in my descriptions that I had not noticed I had described. On the 15th day, in the afternoon, he asked me to hand him his journal. I did. He opened it and looked at the entry from 2 days before the storm, and then he closed it and held it. He said, 3 chapters. "I know," I said. He said, "The migration patterns in the 4th chapter are going to be the difficult part. The data is not as clean as I would like. We'll sort it out," I said. He said, "Yes." He slept after that. I sat at the edge of the ledge and watched the beach and the tree line, and the sea and the sky going down, and I did not write anything. On the 16th day, Arthur Albright died. He died in the early morning, before the light had fully come. I was awake. I had been awake most of the night. The fever had peaked in the night, and I had kept the wound clean and kept him cool with water, and I had been watching him carefully. And then at some point the quality of his breathing changed, and I knew, the way you know even if you have never been present for it before, that the change was the last one. I sat with him for a long time after. The beach was quiet in the early morning. The sea moved. The forest made its sounds. The world continued as it always continues, entirely indifferent to what has just happened in a particular small place within it. I buried him above the high tide line at the back of the beach, beneath the cliff, in a place where the rock sheltered the grave from the wind. It took most of the morning. The ground was soft enough that the work was possible with the tools I had. I marked the grave with a flat piece of driftwood, on which I scratched his initials and the date. AHA October 1887. The year was approximate since I was not entirely certain of the date. The name was not approximate. I climbed back to the ledge and sat there and looked at the beach. The irrational hope I had been carrying for 4 days was gone. In its place was something that I did not have a name for and did not try to name. Something that settled over everything the way the forest settled over the valley, covering it completely and making it harder to see clearly. I sat with it. There was nothing else to do. I wrote in the journal, "Albright died this morning. He was the best naturalist I have known and a better man than most of them, which are not always correlated. He had 3 chapters left on the hawk moths. He had an enormous beard. He had a wife whose name I never learned. I did not ask. I should have asked." Then I wrote, "I am alone again." Then I closed the journal and sat until the light changed. If you're still with me tonight, I'm glad you stayed. This one goes to places I needed to take slowly. If this channel is part of your nights, subscribe. Come back. We'll keep going. On the 17th day, I began to move. Not away from the beach, not yet, but moving because stillness was no longer sustainable. I went back into the forest. I went to the valley. I sat at the edge of the low cliff, and I looked down at the long-necked animals by the stream for a long time. And I wrote about them, and I let the writing do what writing does, which is to hold the world at a manageable distance while still recording it. I found more of the fruit. I found a different plant whose leaves, when I chewed the edge of one, were slightly acidic in a way that suggested nutrients, and I ate a small quantity and waited and felt no ill effects and ate more the following day. I was learning the forest the way you learn any complex system, by observation and repetition and the slow accumulation of small certainties. This tree produces fruit. This path is used by the large animals in the morning and not the afternoon. This pool is used by smaller animals at dusk. These sounds mean the forest is settled. These sounds mean something has changed. On the 21st day, I heard a sound I did not recognize, and I followed it, and I found something I had not been expecting. A river. Not the stream I had been drinking from. A real river, wide and moving, and coming from inland somewhere, and going to the sea somewhere I could not see. The river bank was clear of heavy undergrowth for a considerable distance in both directions, and on the far bank the trees were different, shorter, letting more light through, and the ground there looked more open. I stood at the edge of the river and looked at it for a long time. The river changed things. It changed the geometry of the place. It was a route, running deeper into the interior. It was also a barrier. If I crossed it, I was further from the beach and further from whatever small amount of safety the ledge provided. But the beach and the ledge and the 3 miles of forest I had come to know were also only 3 miles of a world that extended much further in every direction. I decided to follow the river inland. I did not cross it. I followed the near bank, south and then east as the river curved, and I walked for 2 hours, and the river grew wider and the bank became less navigable, and then opened suddenly onto something I had not expected. A floodplain, wide and flat and open, the river spreading out across it in braided channels. The ground between the channels covered in low growth that was easier to move through than the dense forest interior. And on the floodplain, in the afternoon light, animals. Many animals, of many kinds. I sat very carefully at the edge of the tree line, and I watched. There were the long-necked ones, 3 of them, moving slowly across the far side of the plain. There were smaller animals, much smaller, perhaps the size of deer, moving in a loose group through the near channels, picking at the low vegetation. There were things in the water that I could see only as movement and the occasional break of a surface. There were birds, or things close enough to birds that the distinction did not matter at that distance, moving in a flock above the plain with the swirling, murmuring motion of a flock of starlings. And there was something sitting in the open, in the middle of the plain, doing nothing. Large. Not as large as the apex predator on the beach, but large enough that size itself was the first thing you understood about it. Sitting on its haunches, its tail behind it, its head raised, looking at something I could not see from my position at the tree line. It sat there for a very long time without moving. I sat at the tree line and watched it sit. The smaller animals on the plain did not appear to be alarmed by it. They were not approaching it, but they were not fleeing from it either. They maintained a distance and went about their business, and the sitting animal went about its apparent business of sitting, and the plain continued in its complex, layered way. Then something happened. The smaller animals, all of them, simultaneously changed direction. Not in panic, not in the explosive scatter of a prey species that has been startled, but together, smoothly, as though a single decision had been made by a collective mind. They turned and they moved north, and they did not slow until they were at the far edge of the plain. The sitting animal had not moved. But from the tree line on the eastern edge of the plain, something had. I saw it because I was looking in the right direction at the right moment. Movement in the undergrowth, then a pause, then more movement, then another pause. A pattern of movement that was itself a pattern, that had intention in it. Not one animal, several, moving in from the east, using the undergrowth, watching the plain. The sitting animal in the middle of the plain had raised its head. I pressed back into the tree line behind me, and I made myself very small. And I watched. The smaller animals on the far side of the plain were watching too. I could see them, still, arranged at the edge of the distant tree line, doing what prey animals do when a situation is clarifying itself. From the eastern undergrowth they emerged. 5 of them, moving into the open with a kind of deliberate unhurry that was more frightening than speed would have been. Medium size, perhaps 6 feet long. Low carried bodies, tails held out behind for balance. They moved in a spread pattern that covered the width of the plain between the river channels and the eastern tree line, maintaining the spread as they moved, the spacing between individuals remaining constant. The animal in the middle of the plane was on its feet now. What happened next happened quickly enough that I am not certain of the sequence. The 5 animals moved in from 3 sides simultaneously. The central animal moved fast, faster than its size suggested was possible, toward the river. One of the 5 cut that angle. The central animal turned. The 5 closed. I did not see the end of it. I turned and went back into the forest as quickly as I could move, and I did not stop until the sounds of the plane were behind me, and the only sounds around me were the forest sounds. And then I stopped and stood with my back against a tree trunk, and I wrote in the journal with the hands that were not entirely steady. I wrote, "Coordinated hunting. 5 individuals. Maintained formation over the open ground. Closing 3 angles simultaneously. This requires communication. Not visual signals only. Something else. They knew where each other were without looking." I wrote, "Do not be on the open plain." I wrote, "Do not be anywhere they can surround you." On the 26th day, I found the eggs. I had been following a new path I had identified, a route through the forest used by the medium-sized animals that skirted the floodplain to the north. I was moving carefully and paying attention to everything around me when I nearly stepped on one. It was large, larger than any bird egg I had ever seen, pale cream in color, slightly buried in the forest floor, the surface of it warm from the ground heat around it. I stopped, and I looked at it without touching it, and then I looked at the ground around it, and I saw that it was not alone. A cluster of them, perhaps a dozen, arranged in a rough circle, half buried, partly covered by vegetation that had been deliberately placed over them. I stood very still for a very long time. These were not abandoned eggs. The vegetation placed over them meant tending. Something had put that vegetation there. Something was coming back. I backed away slowly and carefully, and I put perhaps 50 feet between myself and the nest before I stopped. Then I sat down, and I thought about this for a while. Eggs meant protein. They also meant returning parents. I did not know what kind of animal had laid them. I did not know how close to hatching they were, or how aggressively the parents defended the nest. I did not know if the eggs were safe to eat, or if I was now between them and whoever was coming back to tend them. I decided that 50 feet was not enough distance, and I put another 100 between myself and the nest and went around it in a wide arc and continued on my way. But I noted the location in the journal with as much precision as I could manage. Everything in this world is information, even what I could not use immediately. Subscribe if this is finding you in the right place tonight. New ones go up every week. And your story ideas in the comments keep this going. We read all of them. The 28th day, I made the decision to move inland. The beach had given me what it could. I knew it well enough to understand its limitations. The ledge was defensible, and the food sources within range of the beach were adequate but not expanding. The forest interior, from everything I had observed, was richer and more complex and potentially more sustaining. It was also more dangerous. But the beach was not safe and the ledge was not permanent, and staying where I was because it was familiar was not a scientific reason to stay. I packed everything I could carry. The remaining tins, the rope, the wire, the 3 specimen jars, the compass, Albright's journal and my own, the folding knife, the tin cup. I looked at Albright's grave before I left. The driftwood marker was still there. The beach was quiet in the morning. The sea was moving steadily against the sand, and the sound of it was the sound I had fallen asleep to for 28 nights, and I would not hear it after today, or not for a while. I said goodbye, and I turned, and I went into the forest. The first day of moving inland was the hardest physically of any day I had spent in this world. The canvas bag was heavier than it looked loaded, and the forest floor required constant attention, and the path I had chosen, following the river on its eastern bank, was not always a path in any navigable sense. By midday, my arms were cut from vegetation and my boots were soaked from 2 crossings of tributary streams, and I had covered perhaps 4 miles by my best estimate, and I was exhausted in a way that had very little reserve behind it. I made camp at the base of a tree. Not an elegant camp, a canvas sheet rigged between roots for shelter, the fire small and carefully placed to minimize smoke, the food tin opened and eaten cold because I did not have the energy to make fire properly. I wrote 2 sentences in the journal, date and location estimate. I fell asleep in the middle of a third. On the 32nd day, I found the high ground. A ridge running roughly east to west, rising above the forest canopy in a way that offered something I had not had since the ledge on the beach. Elevation, visibility, the ability to see what the world looked like from above. I climbed to the ridge top in the early morning, and I stood there and I looked. The forest extended in every direction as far as I could see. In the south, where the beach was, I could make out a faint line of different color where the tree line met the coast, and the sea beyond it. In the east, the forest continued over rolling ground. In the north, something I had not expected, a gap in the forest, a large gap, where something lighter and lower occupied the ground, and above that gap, visible even from this distance, a column of what appeared to be steam or smoke rising into the air. A volcanic feature, something geologically active. I stood on the ridge for a long time looking at that column of steam and thinking about what it might mean, which was several things: heat, mineral-rich water, different vegetation in the thermal zone, potentially an area where large animals did not go. Also, if there was a geothermal feature, the ground around it might be unstable, which was a different kind of danger from the animals, but a danger nonetheless. I noted it in the journal. I watched the steam column until I was sure of its direction from my position on the ridge. Then I climbed back down and began moving north. On the 35th day, I reached the edge of the thermal zone. The change in the air happened before the change in the landscape. A sulfurous quality, not overwhelming but present, layered under the forest smell. Then the temperature of the ground beneath my feet, perceptibly warmer even through my boots. Then the vegetation began to change, thinning, giving way to low plants, and then to open ground scattered with vents from which steam rose in thin columns. The ground was crusted in a way that I recognized from reading about volcanic regions. I tested each step before I committed my weight. Some areas were solid, some were not. I moved carefully. And in this careful movement across the open thermal ground, in the late afternoon of the 35th day, I saw something that I have written about many times since and still cannot explain to my own satisfaction. A creature, perhaps the size of a large dog, was sitting near one of the larger vents. It was not being warmed by it, or not only. It appeared to be watching it, the way you watch a fire, attending to it. The steam rose and shifted in the afternoon air, and the animal watched it shift. I watched the animal watch the steam for a long time. It did not approach the vent, and it did not move away. It simply sat and attended. I am a scientist. I do not ascribe consciousness or interior experience to animals, at least not in the way we use those words for ourselves. And yet, it watched the steam rise, and I watched it watching, and the steam rose, and the afternoon moved toward evening, and eventually the creature stood and turned and disappeared into the low vegetation, and I was left alone on the warm ground with a journal entry that I did not quite know how to write. I wrote, observed, individual animal, apparent attention to non-food stimulus, duration, 40 minutes. Cannot classify behavior within any framework I currently possess. Then I wrote, there is more here than I understand. This is the most honest thing I have written in 35 days. If this is the kind of story you want to come back to, subscribe. We'll keep going as long as you want to go. And drop a story idea in the comments if there's somewhere else you want to go. We'll take you there. On the 40th day, I began to understand that I was not going home. I had been not thinking this thought for 40 days, which is a considerable effort and one that had served a practical purpose. Not thinking the thought had kept me moving and observing and recording and surviving, which was the right use of my energy. Thinking the thought would have made those things harder. But on the 40th day, sitting on the warm ground near the thermal zone in the late afternoon, with the journal on my knee, and the column of steam rising nearby, and the forest stretching in every direction, and the sea invisible behind it, I allowed the thought, no one is coming. If anyone was looking for me, they were looking in 1887 in the Atlantic Ocean for a ship called the Perseverance, and they would find nothing because the Perseverance was at the bottom of an ocean that in 1887 was the same ocean, but in 66 million years ago was a different sea, shallower and warmer, and in a different position relative to the land. No one was coming because no one knew where I was. Because where I was not somewhere that could be located from 1887. Because the storm that had brought me here, whatever mechanism it had employed, was not a mechanism that existed in my understanding of the physical world and was therefore not a mechanism that could be reversed by the application of any science I possessed. I sat with this thought. The steam rose. The forest made its sounds. The ground beneath me was warm and the air around me smelled of sulfur and green things, and the world that existed here before mine. I thought about Portsmouth. I thought about my rooms there, which were cluttered with specimens and books, and Albright's monograph drafts because he always left them with me when he wasn't sure where to store them. I thought about the smell of the Thames at low tide, which I had always found slightly unpleasant, and now thought about with what I can only call tenderness. I thought about a particular pub in Whitechapel that served a pie that I had always considered merely adequate, and now recognized as something I would give considerable things for. Small things, the accumulated texture of a life. I wrote in the journal, I am not going home. Then I wrote, this is the world I am in. It is also, by any scientific measure, the most extraordinary world any naturalist has ever been given access to. I have 43 days of observations. I have described species that science in my time has only bones for. I have watched behaviors that no one in my time could guess at. I am the only person who knows any of this. I wrote, I am going to keep writing. I am going to keep observing. I am going to be a naturalist in the only world currently available to me. I wrote, Albright would have had 3 notebooks full by now. Then I closed the journal for that day, and I watched the steam rise until the light went. On the 47th day, I encountered the hunting group again. Not on the floodplain. In the forest, moving through the mid-level undergrowth, which was worse. The floodplain had offered visibility. The forest did not. I heard them before I saw them. A particular quality of movement in the undergrowth to my left. Not the random movement of an animal passing, but the deliberate, pausing movement of something moving with intention. I stopped, and I listened, and I heard the same quality of movement on my right, further away, and the back of my neck did the thing it does when information reaches it before it reaches the conscious mind. I looked up. The tree nearest to me had branches beginning about 12 feet from the ground. 12 feet was possible if I had something to stand on, and there was nothing to stand on, and 12 feet was therefore not possible in the time available. I looked for the next option, which was a tree with lower branches, and I found one not quite close enough, and I moved toward it, and the movement to my left stopped and then changed direction. I ran. I do not recommend running through Cretaceous undergrowth in a panic. The ferns are at exactly the wrong height to hinder a running person, and the roots of the enormous trees are partly exposed, and the ground is uneven in ways that appear only when you are moving too fast to accommodate them. I fell twice. The second fall was harder than the first, and I lost the tin cup which clattered away somewhere to my right, and I did not stop for it. I reached the tree with the lower branches, and I went up. Not elegantly, not with any composure. I went up the way a frightened person goes up a tree, which is to say fast and without looking down, and using muscles that protested, and not stopping until the branch beneath me felt solid enough, and the ground below felt far enough. I was perhaps 20 feet up. Below me, at the base of the tree, nothing. I sat in the tree for a long time. I listened. The forest settled around me, slowly, the way it settles after a disturbance, the nearest sounds coming back first, and then the further ones, and then the complete, layered texture of it returning. Whatever had been in the undergrowth had gone, or was waiting. I stayed in the tree until the light began to fail, and then I descended very carefully, and I moved quickly and directly back to my camp, and I sat in the entrance of my shelter for a long time. I had lost the tin cup. This was trivial, and it was not trivial. Everything I had was important, because everything was finite and irreplaceable. I had the folding knife. I had the journal and the pencil. I had the compass and the watch. I had the specimen jars. I had the rope and the wire. I had the remaining food, which was down to 6 tins, and after the tins I had what the forest gave me, which so far had been adequate and might continue to be. I wrote in the journal, encountered the hunting group, cannot confirm direct contact, did not wait to confirm. I wrote, lost tin cup. I wrote, consider making fire differently, something that can be signaled. If anyone is ever searching in this time and this place, they will look for smoke. This last was the thought of a man who has not quite finished hoping, even after 47 days, even after everything. I kept the thought. It seemed worth keeping. On the 52nd day, the sky changed. Not the ordinary changes of weather, the clouds and the rain, and the light I had become accustomed to. Something else. In the morning, the sky had a quality I had not seen before, a particular haziness at the horizon that was not quite cloud and not quite clear air, but something between them. A reddish tinge that sat at the edges of the sky and colored the light differently. The animals noticed it before I did. I was on my way to the water source, moving through the familiar route I had worn in the undergrowth over the previous weeks, when I noticed that the forest was quieter than it should be at that hour. Not the sudden silence of a specific threat, the way the forest went silent when the large apex predator was near. Something slower, more pervasive, a gradual reduction, as though a volume control were being turned down over the course of an hour. By the time I reached the water, the forest was the quietest I had heard it since my first night on the beach. I stood at the edge of the stream and I looked at the sky through the gap in the canopy above, and I looked at the reddish tinge at the horizon, and something in my chest felt strange. I knew what a red sky meant in my world. Sailors had a saying about it, but this red was not the red of weather. It was something else. I wrote in the journal, unusual atmospheric conditions, animals subdued, sky anomaly at horizon. I did not write what I was thinking. The thought was too large and too unsteady to write down. I went back to camp. I made the fire higher than usual. I sat beside it, and I watched the sky, and I wrote, and the light changed as the day went on, the reddish tinge spreading from the horizon toward the zenith by degree. By evening, the sky was a color I had no word for. Whatever was coming, it was not something I could stop or prepare for or explain. It was simply the world doing what the world does, which is to change. And the change this time was a change that I was playing by whatever mechanism had brought me here at the exact wrong moment to observe. Or the exact right moment. That depends on how you think about these things. I sat by the fire on the 52nd day, and I wrote everything I could write, everything I had observed in 52 days, as completely and as carefully as I could, because a naturalist's job is to record, and because the act of recording was the last act that was entirely mine. The last entry in the journal is dated the 52nd day. It reads as follows. The sky is a color I have no name for. The forest is silent in a way I have not heard before. I am going to watch what happens and write it down for as long as I can, because this is what I do, and because there is nothing else worth doing with whatever time is left. I have been here 52 days. I have seen things that no one in my world has seen, and I have described them as carefully as I know how. I have survived longer than I expected, and less long than I hoped. Albright would have managed the 4th chapter by now. He always worked better under pressure. I am going to watch the sky now. The journal ends there. What happened to Edmund Marsh after the 52nd day is not recorded, because there was no one to record it and the journal was never found. The world he was watching from the edge of his small fire was approaching the end of its own chapter, the last days of the Cretaceous, the final hours before the sky fell in a way that reset everything. The forest is quiet tonight. It is always quiet in the hours before the largest changes. The fire he kept burns lower. The last entries in the journal are as precise as the first ones, the handwriting steady, the observations careful and complete. Outside the shelter, the sky is changing. He sits and he watches and he writes. And the world, enormous and ancient and entirely indifferent, goes on around him the way it always has, the way it always will, until it doesn't. And then something smaller and quieter inherits what is left, and life, being what it is, continues. Thank you for staying with this one all the way through. If you're here at the end, you're the reason these get made. A subscribe means more than you know. Drop a comment if you want to tell me where you listened from tonight, or what world you'd like to visit next. We'll go there, I promise. New stories every week. The light is low. The fire is burning down. Good night. On the 18th day, I discovered that I had been walking a route without knowing it. Not a route I had chosen, a route I had worn into the undergrowth without noticing, over the many times I had moved between the camp and the stream and the edge of the floodplain. The ferns along the path were slightly lower than the surrounding growth, pressed down by repeated passage. The roots I stepped over were the same roots every time. The place where I turned north was marked by a particular configuration of two fallen branches that had become so familiar I stopped seeing them. I noticed this for the first time on the 18th morning, and I stopped and looked at what I had built without building it. A path. My path. Oh, this is a thing that happens in any environment where a person spends enough time. The world shapes itself around the person, and the person shapes themselves around the world, and after enough time you cannot tell which happened first. I had been in this world for 18 days, and already it was beginning to accommodate me, or I it, which are the same thing seen from different directions. I stood on my path for a while, and I thought about this. Then I thought about the hunting group's paths, which I had now observed 4 times and which also had patterns, which also had the quality of roots worn by repeated use. Animals make paths. People make paths. The difference was one of degree, and not of kind, and standing in the Cretaceous looking at a path I had worn in 3 weeks, I was not sure the degree was as large as I had been trained to assume. I wrote this in the journal, and then I wrote, "This too philosophical for a field journal, and Albright would have told me so." Then I kept walking. The 19th day, I found shelter that was better than anything I had built. A cave, not large, not the dark resonant cavern of a story, but a recess in a limestone formation deep in the forest interior, large enough to stand in, and deep enough that the interior remained dry even when the rain came. The entrance was narrow enough to block easily. The floor was flat. The ceiling was 12 feet above me, high enough to stand and move without crouching. I spent the afternoon investigating it carefully before I committed to anything. I checked every corner of the interior with a lit stick from the fire, and I found nothing living there except insects, which were everywhere, and therefore not remarkable. The rock walls were damp but not wet. The air was cool in a way that the forest usually was not. I moved my camp into the cave the following morning. It took 3 trips to carry everything. By the time I was done and had the fire built in the cave entrance where the draft would take the smoke out rather than fill the interior with it, I was tired in a way that had the particular quality of productive exhaustion. The tiredness of work that resulted in something. I sat in the entrance of the cave and looked out at the forest. The cave changed things. It was the first time since the ledge on the beach that I had a position that felt secure in more than one direction. The ledge had been open to the air on one side and accessible from below. The cave was enclosed on 3 sides, and the entrance was the only variable. I could see the entrance from anywhere in the cave. I could be at the entrance in 2 steps from anywhere in the cave. This mattered more than I would have acknowledged at the start of this. It mattered in the way that sleep mattered and food mattered, as a basic requirement of functioning. The mind needs to not be spending its resources on vigilance every moment in order to do anything else with those resources. I slept deeply in the cave that night, the first time in 18 days that I had slept without waking. The 20th day, I explored the area around the cave more thoroughly than I had on any previous day. Within a mile of the cave, I found 3 separate water sources, a stand of the fruiting trees, the path of the large 4-legged animals which ran within half a mile of the cave entrance, and a clearing where the canopy opened enough that I could see a significant portion of the sky. The clearing was perhaps 40 feet across. In the middle of it, a tree had fallen at some point, recently enough that the wood was still hard, and the fallen trunk provided a natural seat at a useful height. I sat on the trunk in the middle of the clearing and wrote, and the sky above me was open and blue, and the light came down in a single wide column rather than the filtered, distributed green of the forest interior. And I felt something that I had not felt in 20 days. Almost ordinary. Not ordinary in the sense of familiar, or safe or comfortable. Ordinary in the sense of containing within it the possibility of continuing. The sense that the next day was a thing that was going to happen and I was going to be in it, and I would observe it and write about it and learn something from it. This is all a life is, I think. The next day, and the one after. Drop a comment if you are still with me, or don't. Either way, we keep going. And if you're new here tonight, welcome. This is what we do. Slow stories, quiet nights. Subscribe if you want more. On the 22nd day, I watched something that I am still not sure I understood. 2 of the medium-sized animals, not the hunting group, a different type, roughly similar in build but noticeably different in the markings along their flanks, were engaged in what I can only describe as a dispute. Not combat. Combat is something I recognize, and this was not that. There was no contact, no injury, no overt aggression. There was sound, a complex series of calls and responses, and there was movement, a specific kind of movement in which each animal positioned itself relative to the other in a way that changed at each round of the exchange. They would approach and then display. The display involving a raising of the head and a particular configuration of the limbs that appeared to communicate something, and then the other would respond with its own display, and then they would move and the process would repeat. It went on for 20 minutes. I watched every second of it. At the end of it, one of the 2 animals turned and walked away in the direction it had come from. The other watched it go, and then turned in a different direction and went its own way, and the clearing they had been using was empty, and the forest continued. I wrote, dispute resolution, no contact, exchange of signals, withdrawal of 1, no apparent injury on either side. I wrote, the signals are specific enough that both animals understood the same outcome. This is communication. Then I wrote, I am talking myself into something I am not yet sure of, and Albright would tell me to go back to the data. I went back to the data. The data, recorded accurately, was this: 2 animals of the same species engaged in an extended exchange of specific signals that resulted in a clear behavioral outcome, the withdrawal of one party. This outcome was not achieved by force. It was achieved by the exchange of information. This is a description of negotiation. I sat with that for a long time. On the 24th day, the rain came for 3 days. Not the heavy rain of the earlier weeks, the warm, dense downpour that lasted hours. This was a sustained rain, lighter than that, but continuous, running for 3 full days without a meaningful break. The forest floor, already saturated, became a moving system of water, every fern a channel, every depression a pool, the paths I had worn becoming streams. I stayed in the cave. The fire at the entrance kept the interior warm and dry, and the smoke went out into the rain without forming a useful signal, because the rain broke it apart before it cleared the immediate canopy. I had enough food for 3 days if I was careful. And I was careful. And I spent the 3 days writing. I wrote about everything I had observed since arriving, all of it, in the order it had happened and then reorganized by category, by species, by behavior type. I wrote about the long-necked animals and their patterns of movement and the way the young ones stayed near the adults. I wrote about the hunting group and the signals they used and the way they managed the angles of pursuit. I wrote about the creatures in the canopy and the ones on the forest floor and the ones in the water sources and the ones on the thermal plane. I wrote about the creature that had looked at me on the path and tilted its head and then left. I wrote about the animal sitting by the steam vent attending to the rising steam. I wrote about the dispute I had observed and its resolution. By the 3rd day of rain, I had filled a significant portion of Albright's journal and was making inroads on the Lyell margins that I had previously left blank because defacing a geological text had seemed excessive. The rain changed my assessment of what was excessive. On the 4th morning, the rain stopped. The forest, in the hours after sustained rain, has a quality that I have tried to describe accurately and have not quite managed in any of my attempts. It is as though the rain removes something that accumulated between rains, some opacity, some thickness of the air, and leaves behind a clarity that is sharper than usual. The greens are more green. The distances between trees, which in the normal forest light are partly obscured by the moisture and the filtered light, are suddenly visible further than usual. The sounds are cleaner. I stood at the cave entrance in the first rain-free morning and looked at this, and I breathed it in and I thought, this is a beautiful world. It is a world that is trying to kill me by accident and indifference, in the way all worlds try to kill the things they contain if those things are not correctly matched to their requirements. I am not correctly matched to this world's requirements. I am too small and too slow, and my senses are too limited, and my skin is not armored, and I have no natural weapon. But it is a beautiful world. I wrote this in the journal, and I thought Albright would have agreed, which is the best recommendation I know how to give anything. On the 27th day, I discovered something that changed my understanding of the hunting group. I had been watching the edge of the floodplain from the tree line, which I did most afternoons when the light was right and the animals were active. I had a position I had refined over multiple visits, a place where the undergrowth at the tree line edge thinned enough to see the plain, but was that thick enough behind me to suggest concealment. On this day, at the far edge of the plain, the hunting group appeared. There were 6 of them, not 5. One new individual, slightly smaller than the others, keeping to the edge of the formation rather than the interior of it. The group moved across the plain in their characteristic spread formation, the spacing maintained, the movement coordinated. They crossed the open ground and went into the vegetation on the far side and disappeared. Then one of them came back. The smaller one, it came back out onto the plain alone, and it stood at the edge of the vegetation for a moment, and then it turned and went back in. I did not know what I had just seen. I wrote it down exactly as it happened. One animal returned alone to the edge of the plain, stood for a brief moment, returned to the group. Then I wrote, returning to look at something, or returning because something on the plain had changed and required attention. Then I wrote, or returning for a reason I do not have the framework to understand. The honest answer was the third one. I kept it. Subscribe if this is the right kind of story for your nights. We go to a lot of places here, and all of them take time. Knowing you're listening is what makes the time worth spending. On the 31st day, I made contact. Not deliberately. I want to record that clearly. I did not seek this out. It happened, and I observed it, and I wrote it down. I was at the water source, the larger pool a mile north of the cave, filling the specimen jar I now used as a water container. Early morning, the light still low, the forest quiet in the particular way of the hour before the sounds build to their daytime volume. And from the undergrowth on the far side of the pool, the creature that had looked at me on the path on the 6th day stepped out. I recognized it immediately. Not from the species, though the species was recognizable, but from the specific individual. The proportions of it, the particular marking on the flank, a darker patch that ran from the shoulder to the mid-body in a diagonal that I had noted in my original description. It looked at me. I looked at it. This time I did not run, and it did not leave. We stayed in this configuration for perhaps 10 minutes, the pool between us, the morning light coming through the canopy, the forest going about its business around us as though this were not happening. Then it did something. It dipped its head toward the water. Not to drink, the head did not go low enough for that. A gesture, if I am allowed that word, of the head toward the pool. I looked at the pool. I looked at the animal. I said, quietly, "Yes, the water is fine." This was a stupid thing to say. It did not understand English. I knew this, but the voice, I thought, was more useful than silence in that moment. Something familiar making a sound in an unfamiliar direction. The animal tilted its head, the same tilt from the path on the 6th day. Then it walked to the edge of the pool and it drank. I stood on my side of the pool and I watched it drink, and I held very still. When it finished drinking, it raised its head and it looked at me for another moment, and then it turned and went back into the undergrowth and was gone. I stood at the pool for a long time. Then I sat down on the bank and I wrote in the journal what had just happened, and then I sat some more. I am a naturalist, and I do not ascribe intention or intelligence to animals in ways that exceed what the evidence supports. This is what I have trained myself to do over 19 years, and I take it seriously. The evidence supports. One animal approached a shared resource while the second animal was present and appeared to register the second animal's presence before accessing the resource. The evidence does not support contact, communication, any form of social exchange, and yet, I had said the water is fine and the animal had drunk. These two things are probably not related, probably. On the 36th day, the animal came back. I was in the clearing with the fallen trunk, writing, and it came out of the tree line and stood at the edge of the clearing and looked at me. I was sitting on the trunk, and I did not move. It came further into the clearing, not toward me exactly, at an angle that kept the fallen trunk between us and brought it to within perhaps 20 feet of my position. It sat, not in the way a dog sits, not the compact tuck of a small animal, in the way large animals sit when they are resting, the body lowering to the ground in a controlled way, the tail positioned behind. We sat in the clearing. I went on writing. This was partly because there was nothing else useful to do, and partly because I thought movement might be worse than stillness, and writing was the most productive form of stillness I had available. After perhaps 30 minutes, the animal stood and left. I wrote in the journal. Third encounter. Individual appears to have sought out contact, or shared space. The distinction is important, and I cannot determine which applies. Then I wrote, it watched me write for 30 minutes. I do not know what it understood by this. I do not know what I understand by it. Then I wrote, I am glad it came. This is not a scientific observation. It is a human one. I am including it because accuracy requires it. Let me know in the comments where you're listening from tonight, and if you want to suggest the next world we visit, leave it down there. We go where you want to go. On the 39th day, it brought something. I was at the cave entrance in the morning when it appeared at the tree line, perhaps 50 feet away, and after a moment it came forward and it set something down on the ground between us, and then it went back to the tree line and stopped and waited. I walked toward it carefully. The object on the ground was a piece of fruit, one of the yellow interior fruits that I had been eating since the first days. It was intact. It had clearly been carried in the mouth. There were slight marks from teeth on the skin, but it was intact. I picked it up. I looked at the animal at the tree line. Then I opened the folding knife and I cut the fruit in half, and I carried one half back to the cave entrance and set it down, and I ate the other half where I stood. The animal stayed at the tree line for a moment. Then it turned and went into the forest. I stood in front of the cave entrance with half a piece of fruit in my hands, and I thought, this did not happen. Then I thought, this happened and I need to write it down exactly. I wrote it down exactly. Then I sat in the cave entrance for a long time. I do not know what the fruit meant. I do not know if it meant anything in the sense I mean when I use the word meaning. I know that one animal carried a piece of food to a place where another animal was and put it down and waited and then left. I know that this is a behavior I have no framework for. I also know that I was alone in a world 66 million years before my own, and something had brought me breakfast. These are the facts, all of them. On the 44th day, I saw something in the sky. I was in the clearing in the late afternoon when the movement above caught my eye. High up, very high, moving on a thermal above the canopy. Not a bird, not the creatures I had seen in the canopy. Something else, something with a wingspan that I estimated at 30 feet or more, riding the upward air with a stillness that only comes from something that has been doing this for so long that stillness is the default and effort is the exception. I watched it for an hour. It circled above the forest without descending, without calling, without any apparent purpose beyond the thermal itself. The late light caught it on each pass, and in that light it was extraordinary, the wingspan catching the gold of the afternoon in a way that made it visible against the sky long after the detail had gone. Eventually, it moved south, and the thermal took it, and it went over the tree line, and I did not see it again. I wrote, pterosaur, 30-foot wingspan estimated. Thermal soaring, no vocalization observed. Then I wrote, it was the most beautiful thing I have seen in 44 days. Then I wrote, it was the most beautiful thing I have seen in my life. I meant the first thing and the second thing equally. On the 48th day, I tried to teach the animal my name. This is the kind of thing that happens when a person has been alone for too long. I recognize that. I record it accurately and without apology. I was in the clearing, and it came to the edge of the tree line, and I said, Marsh. Edmund Marsh. It looked at me, the head tilt. I said, Marsh, and I touched my chest. It made a sound, low, the 3-second sound from the path on the 6th day. I said, Marsh. It made the sound again, different from the first time in a way I cannot describe precisely, not different enough that I would have noted it as a different sound in a scientific context. Different in the way that the same word can sound different depending on what is behind it. I wrote in the journal, attempted name exchange, results inconclusive. Behavior, it made a sound. Twice. The second time differed from the first in a way I am unable to quantify. Then I wrote, I am calling it Darwin. This is not scientific. It is necessary. Darwin came to the cave entrance 6 more times over the following week. Each time it stayed between 20 and 40 minutes. Each time it showed no sign of aggression. Each time it made its 3-second sound at least once and looked at me while it made it. Each time it left without incident. On the 51st day, it did not come. I noted this in the journal without comment because there was nothing useful to comment. Animals change their patterns. There were 1,000 reasons it might not come. On the 52nd day, the sky began to change. And I sat by my fire on the 52nd evening, and I wrote what I could write, and the sky was a color I had no name for, and the forest was quieter than it had ever been. And I thought about Darwin, and I hoped, with the particular irrational hope of someone who has been alone a long time and found something like companionship in unexpected places, that it was somewhere safe. Wherever safe was, in a world about to change completely. The fire burns lower. The sky is that color. The last entry is dated and clear, and the handwriting does not waver. And Edmund Marsh, naturalist, 43 years old, late of Portsmouth, sits at the entrance of a limestone cave in the Cretaceous forest and watches the sky change and writes about what he sees, which is what he has always done, which is the only thing he knows how to do with whatever is given to him. The world outside is enormous and old and beautiful and about to end. He watches it with everything he has. There are things about the Cretaceous that I understand now that I did not understand in the first days, and that I want to record carefully while I still can. The first is the sound. I wrote about the sound in the early days, and I wrote about it inadequately, which I knew at the time and could not do better because I did not yet know the thing I was describing. I know it better now. The sound of a Cretaceous forest is not the sound of the forests I knew before this. Not because it is louder or quieter, though it is both of those at different hours. It is different in its structure. The forests I knew were structured around birdsong at the upper registers, the calls of mammals in the mid-range, the insects and the ground sounds in the lower. Those registers are separate enough that you can listen to one and notice the others without confusion. The Cretaceous forest does not separate this way. Everything here occupies the same register, not the same pitch, not the same volume, but the same quality of sound. The calls of the canopy creatures and the calls from the undergrowth and the sounds of the large animals at distance and the insects and the rain on the leaves and the movement of the stream. All of it occupies the same sonic space and layers together into a single thing that is not individual sounds, but something more like weather. I have been listening to it for 52 days, and I have not fully parsed it. I do not think it can be parsed. It is not meant to be listened to the way you listen to music, for the individual notes. It is meant to be lived in the way you live in air. You are inside it, and it is inside you, and the distinction between the two stops mattering after a while. This is the first thing I understand now that I did not understand in the first days. The second thing is the scale. In the first days, the scale of everything was wrong, too large. My mind kept trying to correct for it, kept insisting on the familiar proportions of the world I had come from, the correct height of a tree, the correct size of an animal, the correct distance of the horizon. Every time the world refused the correction, the mind produced a mild shock. A small, persistent dissonance between expectation and reality. Now the scale is correct. The tree outside my cave entrance is the right size for a tree. The ferns are the right height for ferns. The long-necked animals in the valley are the right size for animals that eat the tops of those trees. Everything is in proportion because I have been here long enough that this proportion is the one my mind has adopted as the baseline. If I went back to my world now, everything would be too small. I find this interesting, not alarming, though it probably should alarm me. The mind is adaptive in ways that a scientist can observe in himself with the same detachment he would bring to any other phenomenon, if he is disciplined enough. I am disciplined enough, mostly. I am also, occasionally, simply a man who thinks something is interesting, rather than a scientist who finds data relevant. The third thing I understand now is the relationship between the large and the small. In the early days, I thought of the Cretaceous as a world dominated by the large, the apex predator on the beach, the long-necked animals in the valley, the hunting group. Everything that registered immediately as significant was large. The large is not the dominant thing here. The dominant thing here is everything else. The insects, in their 10,000 varieties, outnumber everything else by a factor that cannot be calculated. The small plants and the fungi and the algae in the streams, and the things too small to see without the magnification I do not have. These are the actual substrate of the world. The large animals move through this substrate and disturb it, and feed on it, and enrich it when they die, and the substrate continues without them. The apex predator is extraordinary and rare and immediately legible, and therefore seems dominant. But it eats the same air and the same water and the same earth as everything else, and it will not outlast the algae. I have been thinking about this more since the sky started changing. What the sky is telling me, what the reddish tinge at the horizon, and the quality of the light and the silence of the animals all converge to suggest is that something large is coming. Something that will affect the large animals more than the small ones. Something that the insects and the algae and the small plants and the fungi will survive in ways that the apex predator will not. Because the apex predator needs the large ecosystem to function, and the small things can build an ecosystem from almost nothing. This is not a new idea. I have read about mass extinction events and the theories around them. Standing inside one, watching the sky change, is different from reading about one. If you're listening to this tonight, and the world feels large and uncertain outside your window, I understand that feeling more than I did before all this. Stay. We're almost through together. The fourth thing I understand is what I was doing when I thought I was surviving. I was not surviving. Survival is a word for something you do in the short term, in the gap between danger and safety, in the hours or days before you are rescued, or before you reach somewhere sustainable. What I have been doing for 52 days is not survival. It is habitation. I have been building a life, small and provisional, and without guarantees. But a life in a place and time that was not designed for me. I have a cave. I have fire. I have food sources and water sources and a path I wear every day. I have a journal almost full of the most complete observations of this world that any human has ever made. I have Darwin, who brings me fruit and tilts its head at me and sits in the clearing while I write, and whose absence today sits in my chest in a way that I am not going to examine too directly because there is still writing to be done, and the sky is still changing, and I would like to write clearly until I cannot. This is not survival. This is a life, a short one by any measure, and one that ends in circumstances I would not have chosen, but a life. On the 43rd day, between the days I have already described and the day the sky changed, something happened that I left out of the chronology because I was not sure how to write it. I was in the cave in the early morning, the fire low, not yet fully light outside. The forest was quiet with the particular quality of pre-dawn quiet. Everything paused at the threshold before the day starts. I was half awake, not writing, just present in the way you are present in the half hour before you are fully awake, and the concerns of the day have not yet organized themselves. And in the cave entrance in the early light, Darwin was sitting. I do not know how long it had been there. It was simply there at the entrance in the half-light, in the way that a thing is when it has been there long enough that you find it rather than watch it arrive. We looked at each other for a long time. The forest outside was beginning its morning sequence, the sounds building in their layered way. The fire gave a small amount of warmth and light. The cave smelled of wood smoke and the mineral smell of stone, and the particular smell of 43 days of occupation. Then Darwin made a sound I had not heard before. Not the 3-second sound, something quieter and lower, sustained for perhaps 5 seconds, almost like a drawn breath, but with a quality at the end of it that changed and then resolved. I am not going to describe what this sounded like in terms of the emotion I assigned to it because that would be unscientific and inaccurate. I am going to describe it as a sound I had not heard before, and a sound that, when it finished, left the cave quiet in a way that felt different from the quiet before it. Then Darwin turned and went out into the forest. I sat up. I wrote in the journal, new vocalization, qualities, sustained, low register, terminal inflection, duration, approximately 5 seconds. Then I sat for a while. Then I wrote, I do not know what it meant. I know that I sat in the cave in the early morning and a creature from 66 million years before my own time made a sound that it had never made before and then left, and that this is the most extraordinary thing that has happened to me in 43 days, which is a considerable competition. On the 45th and 46th days I mapped. I had been keeping a rough map in the back of the journal, adding to it as I explored, a sketch of the territory within a mile of the cave and extending outward in the directions I had traveled. On these 2 days, I went systematically around the perimeter of the territory I had established, walking the boundaries, checking my sketched map against the actual landscape, correcting the proportions. The territory was larger than I had thought. The scale on my original sketch was off, and the corrections I made expanded the mapped area considerably. Within the territory, 3 water sources, 4 food-bearing plant types I had identified as reliably edible, the cave, the clearing, the pool where Darwin and I had first shared the water, 2 of the large animal paths that I now crossed with a timing I had worked out, going between their morning and evening use. I also identified, on the second day of mapping, an area I had not previously explored to the northeast, where the ground rose slightly and the tree type changed, denser and different in the color of the bark, and through those trees a sound that I could not identify from the perimeter. I went toward the sound on the afternoon of the 46th day. The trees were cycads, I had determined, a type I recognized from reading and from observation of the form rather than any direct scientific familiarity. They were older than the surrounding forest in some quality that I felt rather than observed, though the observation, if I tried to articulate it, was something about the lichen growth on the bark and the way the lower branches had grown and thickened over what seemed to like a longer time than the surrounding trees. Through these trees, the sound resolved as I approached. Water. A falls of some kind. Not large, but sufficient. Water dropping perhaps 15 feet into a pool below. The pool was clear and cold, and the falls had worn the stone below it smooth, and the whole thing was enclosed by the cycad trunks and the ferns at the base, and it was, in the late afternoon light, more beautiful than I had words for. I sat at the edge of the pool for a long time. There are moments in fieldwork that are not about the data, moments when the world is simply beautiful, and the response to beauty is not to describe it for the record, but to be in it. I have always been better at the former than the latter. Standing at the edge of that pool, in the late afternoon, under the cycad trees, I was, for a while, simply in it. I went back to the cave before dark. I wrote about the pool in the journal, but I did not try to write the beauty. Some things resist that, and I have learned over 52 days to respect the resistance. I went back to the pool 3 more times before the sky changed. On the 49th day, after Darwin's absence had become a fact rather than a day's variation, I made an inventory. Not of the supplies, which I had been keeping current in the journal throughout. An inventory of what I knew. I knew the migratory patterns of the long-necked animals in the valley, their direction and their timing, and their preferred routes through the forest. I knew the hunting group's territory and the way they moved through it, and the signals they used, and the coordination they maintained. I knew the canopy creature's calls, and approximately what each category of call indicated about the state of the canopy and the animals in it. I knew the pool and the falls and the clearing and the thermal zone and the ridge and the river and the floodplain. I knew the fruiting trees and the edible plants and the water sources and the good and bad ground for walking. I knew Darwin, within the limits of what knowing a creature of this type in this time is possible. I wrote all of this in the journal, not as a list, as it is here, but in the full detail that each category warranted. This took most of a day. By the end of it, the journal was nearly full, a few blank pages remaining that I had been saving without quite knowing why. Now I knew why. The final entries, the ones that would matter if anyone ever found this, though the likelihood of anyone finding it was approximately equivalent to the likelihood of my being here in the first place, which was itself approximately equivalent to 0, which had not prevented it from being entirely, irreversibly real. I filled the remaining pages. I wrote the complete record of every species I had observed. I wrote the coordinate estimates for the cave and the valley and the floodplain and the pool. I wrote everything I had concluded about the behavior of the hunting group. I wrote everything I had observed about Darwin. Carefully, and with the full scientific qualification that the data required. And then, in a note I added at the bottom of the last Darwin entry, I wrote, "I do not think the scientific qualification captures it. I think something happened here that I do not have the framework for, and that the framework I have may not be the right one for this kind of observation. I think I should record that." Then I wrote, on the second to last page, "If anyone finds this, it was written by Edmund Marsh, naturalist, late of Portsmouth. The observations are accurate. The conclusions are the best I could reach with what I had. The rest is in the margins." And on the last page, which I am writing now, with the sky that color and the forest that quiet and the fire burning lower in the cave entrance, I am writing this. I have been in this world for 52 days. I have seen things that no one in my world has seen, and I have described them as well as I know how. I have survived, and then I have done more than survived, and the difference between those two things is a difference between managing and living, and I am glad I found it. I am sorry about Albright. I am sorry about the hawk moths. I am sorry that I never asked him about his wife. The sky is changing faster now. Darwin is somewhere in the forest. I hope it is safe. I hope whatever intelligence it has, and I believe it has more than my framework allows me to credit, I hope it knows that what is coming is not a day's disruption or a season's difficulty, but something larger. And I hope it finds deep cover, and I hope it outlasts it. The small things always outlast it. This is the history of the world. The small things endure. I am not a small thing in this world. I am an enormous anomaly, impossibly here, writing in a cave by firelight while the sky outside turns a color I cannot name. But I was here. For 52 days I was here, and I observed it, and I wrote it down, and the observations are true. This is enough. It is more than enough. the fire is burning down. The sky is very beautiful, in the color I have no name for. The forest is quiet. And outside the cave, somewhere in the undergrowth in the direction of the clearing, something is making a sound. Low, sustained, with that particular inflection at the end. 5 seconds. Then quiet. Then the world. There are extended passages from the middle weeks that deserve their full telling. I am going back to fill them now because the journal deserves completeness, and because the night is long and the fire still has wood in it. The days between the 28th and the 31st, the days I moved inland and before I found the cave, were the hardest of the entire stay here. Not because of any single dramatic event. The hardest days are rarely about a single event. They are about the accumulation of small difficulties in a continuous sequence without sufficient pause between them to recover. The canvas bag cutting into the shoulder. The route through undergrowth that looked navigable and was not. The water source I located on the second day of moving that turned out to be stagnant. The particular greenish tinge of it unmistakable once I was close enough to see it properly, which was after I had already come down a significant slope to reach it and would need to go back up. The rain that arrived on the third day of moving and turned the forest floor into something that my boots, which were already at the end of their useful life, could not manage without taking damage. My boots gave out on the morning of the 30th day. The left one first. The sole separated from the upper at the toe, which I repaired with wire. But the wire pulled through the leather by the end of the morning because the leather was waterlogged and had lost its tensile strength. I walked the afternoon with the sole of my left boot flapping with each step, which is a specific kind of miserable that anyone who has experienced it will recognize and no one who has not will quite be able to imagine. I repaired it that evening with what I had. The wire, bound more carefully this time through the upper in 2 places. A piece of bark underneath as an additional sole layer. It held for 2 more days and then it did not. I made a kind of sandal from the bark and the remaining wire and a piece of canvas from the bag. It was not elegant. It was functional in the specific sense of allowing me to continue walking on the forest floor without the skin of my foot making direct contact with everything on it, which, in a world where everything on the forest floor was either a living organism or the remains of one, was more important than elegance. The right boot lasted another week. When it gave way, I made a matching sandal, and I wore the bark sandals for the remainder of my time here. They required daily maintenance, tightening the wire and replacing sections of the bark as they wore through. But they were manageable, and they taught me something useful, which is that most of what I had thought of as requirements were, in practice, preferences. A boot is a preference. The foot, given appropriate protection of any kind, continues. I wrote this in the journal on the day I finished the second sandal, and I wrote it with the specific feeling that it contained something applicable well beyond footwear. I was not sure what exactly. It seemed like the kind of sentence that would mean something useful later. The 30th night, the second night of moving inland, I slept in the open. Not deliberately. The shelter I had rigged from the canvas and the tree failed in the night. Some wind coming through the canopy at an angle I had not anticipated pulling the canvas loose from one of its fastenings and dropping it. And I was awake with the canvas around me, and the forest open above, and the rain, light but present, coming down on my face. I lay there for a moment, and looked up at the forest ceiling above me, and the rain fell down through it in the way rain falls through heavy canopy. Not in drops anymore, but in irregular streams off the leaves, each leaf a small catchment and a small release. The water finding its way down in stages and reaching me less as rain and more as an irregular dripping from a ceiling that was very dark and very high. The forest was making its night sounds. I had learned enough of them by this point to know that nothing immediately concerning was in the sounds. The distant low call that I heard now most nights, still unidentified, still making everything else quiet when it sounded. The closer sounds of smaller creatures, the insects and the things the size of birds that moved in the mid-canopy at night. A creak from somewhere above me that was a branch under windload, one of the sounds I had identified in the first week and had successfully learned to hear as structural rather than biological. I lay in the canvas, and the rain came down, and I looked up at the dark, and I was, in a way that had nothing to do with survival, and everything to do with something else, content. Not happy. I want to be precise about this. Not happy in the sense of feeling good about the situation, which was cold and wet and unresolved in every important direction. Content in the sense of completely present, not worrying about the future, which I had no ability to change, and not mourning the past, which I had no ability to recover, and simply here, in this exact configuration of canvas and forest and rain and night, completely occupying the moment. I had not felt this way since before the storm. I felt it in unlikely conditions on the floor of a Cretaceous forest in the rain, and I note it because accuracy requires it, and because it surprised me enough that it seems worth the ink. In the morning, I got up and re-rigged the shelter and kept moving. There are two creatures I observed in the middle weeks that I have not yet described fully, and that deserve their full description. The first I encountered on the 33rd day, 3 days after finding the cave. I was following the ridge northeast from my established position, moving toward the thermal zone but along the high ground rather than through the valley. The ridge gave occasional views over the canopy, the ground falling away on both sides, so that for 100 feet or so I was walking above the tree line, with the canopy below me to the east and west and the sky directly overhead. It was in one of these exposed sections that I saw the creature. It was above me, high above me, not the thermal soaring of the pterosaur I had seen later, which was a gliding, passive movement. This was powered flight. Actual wing strokes, irregular and strong, carrying something much smaller than the pterosaur but flying with a directness that the thermal soarer had not had. It passed overhead perhaps 40 feet up, and I had perhaps 8 seconds of clear sighting before it went over the ridge and descended into the eastern canopy. Feathered. This much was unmistakable, the same quality of feathering I had seen in the canopy creature in the first week, but at this scale clearly visible, clearly structural, not decorative. Wingspan, perhaps 6 feet. Body carried roughly horizontal with a long tail behind. Not a fantail like the birds I knew, but a long graduated tail that was itself feathered. The head was forward, the neck extended, and the beak, if beak is the right word, was long and forward-pointing. It was neither entirely bird nor entirely reptile. It was something between them, and that betweenness was the most extraordinary thing about it, because I was watching evolution in process, watching the space between what had been and what would be occupied by something that was both at once. I sat down on the ridge and I wrote for 20 minutes without stopping because the details were available, and I did not know how long they would stay that way. Then I sat and I looked at the sky where it had gone, and I thought about what it was seeing from up there. The forest, the river, the valley with its enormous animals, the sea in the south, visible perhaps from that height, the pale line of coast and the water beyond. Everything from up there and everything continuing in the way it had been continuing for millions of years before I arrived and would continue for a few days more before the sky changed. I thought about what it would be like to see it from above, the full extent of it. The second creature I want to describe was smaller, much smaller, the size of my closed fist. I found it on the 38th day, on the ground near the pool by the waterfall, and I nearly stepped on it. It was on a rock at the edge of the pool, in a patch of sunlight that had come through the canopy at the right angle to warm that specific rock, and it was so still that I genuinely did not see it until I was close enough that the details were unavoidable. Brown, mostly. A mottled pattern that matched the rock beneath it with an accuracy that was not coincidence. 4 limbs, low and lateral. The body close to the rock surface. A head that was very slightly raised, the eye just visible, catching the light. A lizard, or something close enough to a lizard that the word is more useful than none. I crouched very slowly, and I looked at it, and it did not move. The eye tracked me. The body did not. The eye was gold, specifically gold, not amber, not yellow, the color of old metal in afternoon light. I looked at the gold eye for a long time. Then I wrote in the journal, small reptile, approximate length 12 centimeters, excellent camouflage, pattern matched to the rock substrate, lateral limbs suggesting ground-dwelling rather than arboreal, eye position, lateral with some forward component, iris color, gold, status, undisturbed. Then I wrote, the gold eye. I keep thinking about the gold eye. I do not know what it means that something so small and so perfectly suited to its exact rock on its exact pool edge has a gold eye. I do not know what it means that I am sitting beside it in the Cretaceous writing in a journal, and we are both, in this moment, equally here. Then I stood up very carefully and went around the pool without disturbing it. If you're still here, that means something. These slow ones, the ones that ask you to stay with them for a long time, they're the ones that stay with me too. Subscribe if this is your kind of night, and leave a story idea in the comments if there's a world you want to visit. We read them all. There are sounds I want to describe that I have mentioned in passing and not given their full account. The first is the sound the long-necked animals made when they called to each other. I heard it first in the valley and thought it was a geological sound, some process of the rock or the water, because the frequency of it was too low to register immediately as biological. It was below the range where the ear identifies sound as sound, and into the range where sound becomes vibration. Felt rather than heard. A pressure change in the air around you that the chest registers before the ear does. When I understood what was producing it, I sat in the valley in the late afternoon and I listened to them call across the water to each other, the calls spaced widely apart. Each one answered after a pause that was the sound traveling across the valley, and then the response forming and traveling back. A conversation in a register that was not designed for anything smaller than what was having it. The second sound is the forest at absolute midnight. I do not mean quiet. The forest is never quiet in the sense I would have meant before coming here. I mean the particular version of the forest's continuous sound that exists at the exact middle of the night, when the day sounds have fully given way to the night sounds, and the night sounds have settled into their mature version, rather than the transitional one. At this hour, the insect layer is at its most complete, every frequency occupied, every niche filled, the wall of it continuous and unbroken, and above it the night calls of the things that move in darkness, and above those the occasional far sound of something very large moving somewhere I cannot see. All of it together, all of it without cease. I lay in the cave on many nights listening to this, and it was in a way that I did not expect and cannot fully explain, deeply and completely restful. Not because it was quiet, because it was full, because the fullness of it meant the world was working correctly, all of its parts functioning, each one in relation to every other. The world at midnight, making its complete sound. The third sound is something I heard only once, on the 41st day, and which I have been trying to describe accurately ever since and have not quite managed. I was near the eastern edge of my mapped territory, at a place I had not been before, where the ground rose into a low bluff and the rock was exposed in a face perhaps 30 feet high. The face had a crack running through it, horizontal, perhaps 2/3 of the way up, and in the late morning the wind, coming from the east, entered this crack and produced a sound. Not a whistle, though it had qualities of a whistle. Not a hum, though it had qualities of a hum. It was sustained, varying slightly as the wind varied, and it had a resonance in the rock of the bluff that deepened it and spread it into a frequency range wider than wind through stone usually produces. I sat at the base of the bluff and listened to it for an hour. The wind made the rock speak, and the rock said something in a language made of nothing but frequency and duration. And I sat underneath it, and I let it go through me, which is what sound does when you stop processing it and simply receive it. On the way back from the bluff that afternoon, I was thinking about the sound, and not, as a consequence, thinking carefully enough about where I was putting my feet. And I stepped off a root I thought was solid into a gap between roots that I had not seen, and went down hard on my left side, the left hand taking most of the impact. I had injured this hand before, in the fall on the 10th day on the beach, and the same joint in the thumb that had been strained then was the joint that took the worst of this fall. For 2 days, the thumb was swollen and largely useless, and I wrote left-handed, which I have never been able to do with any facility, and the entries for those 2 days are shorter than any other entries in the journal. They say, present, observing, thumb, and then the date. On the 3rd day, the swelling reduced enough that I could write normally, and I wrote several pages to make up for the 2 short entries, which Albright would have found either disciplined or obsessive depending on his mood. The 43rd day, before Darwin's sound in the cave, the full day. I went to the valley. I had not been to the valley for 8 days, longer than any previous gap, and I felt approaching it along the path I had worn through the forest on the eastern side of the ridge, something that I can only describe as anticipation, not excitement, which is too alert a word for the pace of this world. Something slower and quieter, the knowledge that something was coming that I had been looking forward to without quite registering that I was looking forward to it. I came to the edge of the cliff above the valley in the late morning. The valley was full. not full in the way it had been on any previous visit. Full in the sense of occupied more completely than before. More animals in more configurations. The stream banked on both sides and the flat ground between covered with the movement of bodies that I had to look at for a long time before I could organize what I was seeing. The long-necked animals were there, more of them than I had counted before. Perhaps 12 adults and several young. But there were also other animals, kinds I had not seen in the valley before. Medium-sized, four-legged animals that moved between the larger ones with the careful attention of creatures that know they are sharing space with something that could end them by accident rather than intent. And on the far bank, a group of animals I recognized as related to the hunting group, but different, larger, fewer, moving along the water's edge without the spread formation of the hunters, more loosely arranged, attending to the water rather than the ground. The valley was a meeting place, not a planned one, not a social one in any sense I could verify, but a convergence, a place where the patterns of many different animals' movements happened to intersect, and today was one of the days when that intersection was complete. I sat at the edge of the cliff for the whole of the afternoon. I watched everything I could watch. I wrote constantly, filling pages with species descriptions and behavioral notes and the interactions between animals of different types. The way the larger ones moved around each other, the way the smaller ones moved around the larger ones. The particular distances that seemed to be understood by all parties as the appropriate minimum, and the adjustments made when those distances were encroached upon. None of it was violent. All of it was negotiated, in the way that large gatherings of any animal are negotiated, by position and signal, and the accumulated understanding of what each type of body means to every other type. I watched this, and I wrote about it, and the afternoon went, and the light changed in the valley from the direct light of midday to the angled golden light of late afternoon. And then the animals began, one by one and in small groups, to move toward the tree line, and the density of the valley reduced, and by the time the light was going, the valley was nearly empty again. I stayed until the last of them were gone. Then I climbed down to the valley floor, which I had never done before, always watching from above. And I walked along the bank of the stream in the empty valley in the last of the light. The prints in the mud at the water's edge were extraordinary. Every size, every configuration, the enormous round prints of the long-necked adults, deep enough that the water seeped into the impressions. The three-toed prints of the running animals, clear and precise. The smaller prints of the medium-bodied ones, various and overlapping. A record of the afternoon pressed into the mud, already beginning to smooth at the edges as the water seeped in. I crouched at the water's edge, and I looked at this record, and I thought about all the mud of all the rivers of all the times that followed this one, and the prints pressed into all that mud, and how much of it was preserved, and how much lost, and how the line between those two outcomes was chance rather than anything else. I am preserved in Albright's journal, 52 days of pressed record in a cave in the Cretaceous. Whether that record outlasts the mud of the valley floor is a question I cannot answer. I walked back through the empty valley and up those paths and through the forest to the cave in the dark, navigating by the stars where they showed through the canopy and by the compass bearing where they did not. And I reached the cave, and I made the fire, and I wrote until I was too tired to hold the pencil, and then I slept with the journal on my chest the way I had slept with the Lyle on the first night on the beach. This is the life I have built here. Tomorrow, the sky will be that color again. Tonight, the fire is warm and the forest is making its complete sound, and the smoke from the entrance goes up into the dark and disperses into the canopy above. And I am here, in this exact place, writing this. Edmund Marsh, naturalist. 52 days. All of it true. I want to talk about the water. Every water source I found here is different from every other one, which I had not expected. I had expected water to be water, more or less, the same mineral quality, giving the same experience of drinking. This is not the case. The stream near the beach where I first drank was cold and tasted of stone and the particular freshness of very clean water. The larger stream in the forest interior was warmer and had a faint taste of the organic matter on the forest floor through which it ran. A kind of green taste, not unpleasant, the taste of a living system's product. The pool at the waterfall was the coldest water I found here, coming from somewhere higher in the rock, and it had a mineral quality that was almost metallic, not iron exactly, something underneath iron, and drinking from it was the most distinctly refreshing experience of any water I encountered. The thermal zone water, which I did not drink but tasted with a careful touch of the finger, was warm and sulphurous and clearly not for drinking, which the body established without any need for scientific analysis. The river I found on the 21st day was different again, wide and deep and moving at a pace that suggested a long journey from somewhere far inland. It carried particles of something that made it slightly cloudy in a way that none of the other sources were. And the smell of it was the smell of distance and altitude, the smell of water that had started high and come a long way down. I am writing about water at some length because it is the thing I have thought about most consistently throughout these 52 days. You do not think about water when you have it reliably. You think about almost nothing else when you have it unreliably. And the unreliability of it, the constant need to know where the next source was and how far I was from it and how much I had in the specimen jar and how long that would last, made it the organizing concern of every day. Every route I took was partly a water route. Every camp location was partly a water decision. Every day began and ended with the question of the water. This is also true everywhere in every time. We just do not feel it the way I felt it here, because in most times and places there is a system between us and the problem. A pipe, or a pump, or a reservoir. Something built to hold the answer so we do not have to hold the question. Here, there was no system, just me, and the ground and whatever the ground was willing to give up. I found it every day. This is worth saying. Every day I found the water, and the water was sufficient, and I did not run out, and I did not get sick from it. This is not a given. This was partly knowledge and partly pattern recognition, and partly, I will admit, luck, which is the thing that underlies most survival, even when the survivor is inclined to credit skill. I was lucky here, in the ways that mattered, unlucky in others. But the water was always there one way or another, and the forest always had food in it somewhere, and the cave was solid, and the fire was maintainable, and Darwin came and sat in the clearing. These are the things that were given to me by this world. I am recording them as clearly as I have recorded the difficulties, because a complete account requires both, and because this is what I have, a complete account. Edmund Marsh, naturalist. Portsmouth. the fire is lower. The night outside the cave is the night of the 52nd day, and it is very beautiful and very quiet. And there are things living in it that have no names yet, in any language, in any time, and they are going about the business of being alive in the only world they have ever known. And that world is sufficient and complete, and full of a depth and complexity that I have spent 52 days touching the outer edge of and have not reached the center of, and could not reach the center of in a lifetime. That is what I want the last thing I write to be. Not a summary, not a conclusion, just that. The world is deeper than any one life can reach. It always has been. It always will be.